was an action-packed night. There was a lot of football going on, then the NBA Finals Game 7 and a new Game of Thrones episode. So if Magnus followed everything he would usually follow, he can't have slept much more than 2-3 hours, but he does look fresh.
And we see two young gentlemen there with I Love Chess t-shirts to make the first move for Levon Aronian. The two of them grabbing the e-pawn at the same time. That's so cute. e4 on the board. And Levon really enjoys it, it seems.
Looks like they haven't done their homework. Levon never plays e4. Goes c4, d4, knight f3. e4 is way too risky. It's unprotected out there, alone.
Do you think he will take it back? And
of course he will.
It's a good move. The other day we saw knight f3 being taken back, now e4. I think he's discussing whether he likes e4.
He does not like it. He's one of the few elite players who does not really go e4. Almost everybody else is able to go both e4 and d4. Even Vladimir Kramnik we've seen play quite a bit of e4 recently, but Levon tends to stick to his guns and open with the knight, the c or the d pawn, and there he goes for one d4. This is the game we're gonna focus on this round. Gotta go with the world champion and Levon Aronian also in the top 3.
Can we bring up the board of the game?
No updates here yet, but I'm sure they will come in any second.
And we
For
see
now,
this
we're
angle
going
is
to
a
go
lot
with the eye
better.
test. Looks like Magnus once again put a pawn on f5. He seems to believe in Blitz. He can get away with weakening his king on the, I don't know if he did it on the first or on the second move, but from what I can tell, which is not all that much, they're playing a stone wall, and Levon Aronian goes for an early exchange of bishops with bishop to f4, which was declined by Magnus.
Let's see the
Here we
move
got the
order,
position.
how they reach this position.
Yeah, Magnus sticks to e6, c4, f5 this time. No shenanigans. Knight h3 might look a little funny at first sight, but it is directed against the upcoming d5 because it's useful for this knight to control the f4 square. It's one of the main moves here. d5 castles, bishop d6, bishop f4. Exchanging these bishops would be in white's favor. This is the so-called good black bishop, therefore Magnus keeps it with bishop e7. He's arguing that only one white piece can go to the f4 square, and therefore he doesn't mind having the bishop block the square for his own knight. Levon goes queen c2, standard setup. The question for him is going to be how he wants to arrange his knights. If he wants to bring this knight to f3, which would be the typical plan, or if maybe he wants to even, I don't think he wants to exchange his bishop, but move it early and then try to clear the f4 square.
Would that be any typical to exchange this bishop for the knight? The
No,
e8
normally
knight?
you don't do it. It's still a bishop, and just to get rid of it for an undeveloped knight on b8 would be a bit much. It's not out of the question, especially after Magnus is provoking him with h6, weakening the g6 square. Now you could give more serious consideration to this, but I still do not believe that Levon Aronian, a classical player, would part with the bishop all that easily.
Yeah, it looks just too nice of a bishop on f4. The only problem, as you said, that two pieces are heading to the same square, but maybe we could place it on e5 and then knight f4. I'm just worried that if we play bishop e5 at some point, knight d7, could that bishop just be taken?
That could indeed happen. We'll see what Levon goes for. h6 is pretty much telegraphing Magnus's intention to go g5, leave that knight crippled. Hence, yeah, the more I talk about it, the more consideration I would give to bishop b8 and knight to f4. But good thing for us is that it's Levon Aronian's problem how to solve this, and he doesn't seem all that concerned. Goes knight to c3. Now that Magnus has indicated he's planning to weaken his kingside with g5, this knight d2, knight f3 makes less sense, because then there would always be g4 looming, hitting both knights. And he does go g5
on the board, so this is going to be a very sharp position with Magnus Carlsen weakening his king on purpose so that he could have some kind of an attack on the king side.
Bishop to e5, white will typically follow up with either f3 or f4, probably f3, hinting at an e4 break and also making it harder for black to checkmate him with some plans like queen h5, knight g4. I prefer white, but I always prefer white in any stonewall position, so that does not mean much yet.
Yeah, the stonewall is a funny structure that always seems to be bad for black, but at the same time it's not easy to crack it.
Indeed, and Magnus has won some nice games in it. He defeated Vishy Anand in a tournament game. I believe he also won a game against Fabian Caruana with it, so it's not an offbeat choice for him. He does believe in this stuff. Bishop e5, knight bd7 is on the board, hinting at knight takes e5, followed by knight somewhere, knight e4 or even knight g4, targeting the e5 pawn. And once again, Levon has a decision to make. f4 is a move. f3 might be too slow now, because I think you just take and go knight d7, and doesn't block all that harmonious for white.
You need to protect the c5 pawn somehow, and then you've just played f3, so pushing f4 in 2 moves. And in general, I'm not sure that he wants to go f4.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about his bishop e5 choice. You could make a case for either a passive-looking move like bishop d2 to follow up with f3, or once again, giving this bishop up on b8, so you get rid of that headache. And now Levon Aronian is lost in thought. Knight bd7, maybe he's considering moves like c takes d5, when currently e takes d5 wouldn't work because of queen f5. This is the normal recapture.
What did he display? A pawn move?
Moved a pawn, either f4 or f3 would be my guess, but I could not see it very clearly.
Do we have another camera from the playing hall maybe, or can we zoom out this one so that we see the pieces?
He's played f3. Now the board has updated in the meantime. That is the
Okay,
consistent
f3.
move, but I'm still curious what he's up to after knight e5 and knight d7. Of course, you can go f4 and say, okay, I lost the tempo, but I forced you to determine the structure. This would become very double-edged. Maybe knight to b6. Black would like to provoke this, so he could put his bishop on e6. And I guess Levon would keep the tension, maybe even sacrifice a pawn with b3. I'm not sure. It's over my head, and of course Magnus Carlsen does not turn down that invitation to grab the bishop and go knight d7. Which, yeah, to my mind, looks pretty decent for black. The problem he has to solve is what to do with this bishop, the typical Stonewall problem. It's a long way from any decent squares. b6, bishop b7 is sometimes the arrangement, but here after f4, any b6 would run into trouble on this diagonal.
Some sacrifices on d5.
Yes. You can't do this, therefore Magnus plays even more greedy lead than I expected. He goes d takes c4, grabs a pawn. I don't think the idea is so much to win a pawn, but to gain the d5 square for his knight.
Knight b1, was that the move?
It's possible. Knight a4 came to mind, or knight b1. The idea is to regain this pawn. If knight b6, then knight bd2, and the pawn drops, while b5 drops the c6 pawn. So Carlsen can't really keep it, but I still expect him to play knight b6, headed towards that d5 square. Aronian, on the other hand, is trying to bring his knight to c4, so his knight would be eyeing the d6 square. And should he manage to stabilize, he can still try to open the center with e4 and make the black king feel a little uncomfortable. So a very tense game between two of the chess superstars of our time.
I do like white. The only thing that is, I think, not very well placed is the h3 knight, but that's just one piece, while black has more tasks to solve, especially the c8 bishop and the a8 rook. What has happened there?
Magnus threw in gf, gf, probably wants to make sure there's no fg opening his king's position on white's terms, and then played knight b6. I'm still expecting knight d2, and yeah, either knight d5, or maybe he wants to go in super greedy mode and go for something like this, stopping white from regaining the pawn with knight takes c4 so easily. Very tense situation. Levon could also think about just ignoring that pawn and going for king h1, bishop f3, rook g1, try to be first to the g file. Once again, going after the black king. But we've seen in earlier games that giving the world champion extra material tends to be a bad idea.
Knight d5 is on the board.
Both players spent a lot of time on the post-opening phase here, so we're gonna see time travel very quickly. King h8 is a move you have to play sooner rather than later, just to get out of the potentially dangerous open g file. Some construction work going on. This building is from 1500, so it requires quite a bit of fixing once in a while. It's Monday morning, therefore get used to it.
This is going to be great. The last 9 rounds, the final decisive rounds, and we have some extra sound effects from the background.
Knight d2, knight d5, knight c4, king h8, nothing out of the ordinary. Situation is still extremely tense. White has to somehow stabilize on the king side and try to be first to the g file. Well, black, now he could think about b6, bishop b7, followed by c5 to give this bishop something to do, or just try to mobilize as quickly as possible with bishop d7, queen h5, rook g8, rook g7. Could go either way, which is the usual cop-out.
Just so interesting to see that they are both down to a minute or a minute and a half. So they have made only 20, 21 moves, and they barely have time left on the clock.
Yeah, Levon is trying to force the issue now with knight d6 after Carlsen went bishop d7 and rook d8. Of course, provoking bishop takes d6, ed. And this pawn could very well be a weakness, but at the very least he got rid of black's very strong bishop, and he's opened further inroads towards the black king. Rook g1, intending bishop takes d5, queen c3 check. Therefore, Magnus has to be very careful, and he decides not to be careful, but to fight fire with fire, goes for e5 breakthrough in the center.
I like this decision because I was worried that he would end up with a bad bishop against good knight. Well, not that the h3 knight is brilliant, but the bishop on d7 with the pawns on e6 and c6 was just horrible.
Yeah, now Levon has to calculate, and he is down to 29 seconds, so he can't spend a lot of time on it. He took on e5, queen c5, defending d6 and hinting at something takes d5. The problem for him is it's never really much of a threat to take here, because I would open this diagonal for the bishop, so you can't really do that. Carlsen played bishop e6.
And now rook f7 on the board, the last move of the world champion.
Not sure what Aronian did after the bishop e6. Our board here is a little bit delayed. It looks like the players are playing too fast for it to catch up. Levon Aronian's clock is running down to 5 seconds, so he better make some moves. And it seems like Carlsen has once again managed to stabilize and get an endgame. Aronian took the pawn on a7, rook f7, queen d4, rook d7. He's going to get this pawn back when his solidly arranged pieces should at the very least guarantee he's not in trouble. I'm not sure if he's better, because the pawn structure is it's not symmetrical, but both sides have similar weaknesses, so it should be roughly equal.
This is the moment when we wish that the Norwegian water company would not sponsor Magnus Carlsen, because we cannot see the board from his bottle. At the same time, Vishanen has won his game against Vasilin Topalov, so we announced that we will stick to this game between Levon Aronian and Magnus Carlsen.
Some action. What happened here?
Rook e3 is what I see, but the knight ended up on c2, is that?
Magnus decided not to take because knight f4 would be awkward to meet. Instead, he went for knight e3 and knight c4. Going after the b2 pawn.
People really don't want us to see the board. It's either the bottle or somebody stands there. Now, finally. Levon Aronian is down to 7 seconds.
Levon is now a pawn down. He's tried to generate some initiative, but I have a feeling he's missed this move. Rook takes d6. Point being that after rook d6, knight d6, bishop f7, knight f7, black manages to protect everything and keep an extra pawn, so he needs a clever idea here, and I can't see it. Bishop f7, rook d4, knight e6, runs into rook d1 check. Looks like Magnus Carlsen has once again managed to outsmart his opponent, and yeah, now it's just a pawn up for black, and Magnus Carlsen should normally convert this advantage. His pieces are on good squares, everything's protected. The rook went to a8 to target the a4 pawn. Carlsen is doing very well here, but he's shaking his head. Maybe something happened over the last couple of moves.
Oh, a pawn was taken there, and another pawn.
It seems like he blundered some of his hard-earned pawns. How did that happen? Okay, a8, rook d4, went c5, knight d5 check, king to e6, and it seems like after knight c7, king d7, he missed rook d6, king c7, rook takes h6, reclaiming a pawn. You could take on a4, but that runs into rook h7, winning the bishop, so he couldn't do that. Instead went bishop c4.
This will be just draw and rook endgame, unless this h pawn promotes. There's also counterplay with the c pass pawn. This should be a draw.
Yeah, a lot of events here, hard to keep track, but Levon must feel good about himself that he got his pawn back, and now he's no longer worse, I would guess.
They agreed to a draw. That was a very eventful game. Lots of things happened. Magnus Carlsen had a healthy pawn up, and then he blundered it back. At the same time, the second placed Vasiso has just lost to